In this video, I'm planning on going over what a program is made of. And first, this is just going to be really like a really broad overview of what basically all programs are made of. So we're going to be using C++ in this class, so we're going to get specifically into the specifics of C++ shortly, but before we do that, I just want to go over what the parts of all programs, so these are also the parts of C++ programs. Basically, all programs contain these, like all programming languages contain these parts. And this is really helpful to switch between different programming languages, because in this class we're learning C++, but then, like, let's say later on you need to write a program in, say, Java or Python. You're going to be able to switch into Java or Python pretty easily, just because you know what the parts of a program are, you know what makes up a program, and so it's just a matter of changing some of your syntax and a few other basic things, but the program itself is still going to basically be the same. So what is a program made of? So first of all programs have what's called keywords, or these are also called reserved words. And so these are words that have a special meaning in the programming language, and they can only be used for their purpose. So I'm just going to say these are words that have a special meaning, and they can only be used for their intended purpose. So we're going to get specifically into the keywords and reserved words for C++, but basically the point here is that all programming languages have certain keywords or reserved words. And so these are just words that have a special meaning. The next thing that all programs have is what's called programmer-defined identifiers. And one of those, so a type of programmer-defined identifier is a variable. So for those of you who have programmed before, you probably know what a variable is, but for those of you who haven't programmed before, we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about variables and how you're going to use variables in your program. But programmer-defined identifiers and variables are a type of programmer-defined identifier. These are basically words or names that are defined by the programmer. So words or names defined by the programmer. So these are kind of the opposite of the keywords or reserved words, because these are words that you define, whereas the keywords and reserved words are words that are special to the programming language that you're using. And the next is the next thing that all programs have is operators. So what an operator is let's say that you're adding two numbers together. So let's say you have y plus x. So this is your operator. So your operator is the plus sign. And then your operands, this is just some terminology, the x and y are called your operands. So anything that performs math is an operator, so like plus, multiply, divide, the assignment operator, so equals. These are all operators. So we're going to learn more about some specific operators in C++ a little bit later, but all programs have operators. The next thing that all programs have is punctuation. So punctuation is, so if you think about like the English language. So if you're writing a sentence, you're going to put a period at the end. So that period kind of marks the end of the sentence. So what punctuation does in your program is that it marks the beginning or end of programming statements. So this is basically a character that marks beginning and of programming statements. And then the last thing that pretty much all programs have is some kind of syntax. So the syntax, I like to think of this as just the rules. So the syntax are rules that you have to follow when you're constructing a program. And so the syntax basically says how your keywords and operators are used and where your punctuation goes. So all programming languages have these elements. We're going to be talking specifically about C++ in this class in regards to these elements. So let's look at where each of these things are in a really simple program. So first of all, we're going to talk about comments shortly, but this line right here with the 2 forward slashes, this is basically a comment. And so what a comment does is it allows us to write something in the program that basically tells the programmer what the program's doing or what that particular line of code is doing. So this program, just really briefly, I want to tell you what this program's doing. Don't worry too much about the details of the program right now because we're going to get to that. But just so you know really briefly what this program is doing, first of all, we look at the comment at the top. It says, this program calculates the user's pay. Okay, so we know that's what the program's doing. And then if we come down here, so we're declaring some variables here. And so remember, variables are things that we name. And we're going to talk about what this double is in a minute. But basically, we're just saying that we're going to store, we're saying that we need, with this line of code, we're saying that we need a spot in memory to store hours, rate, and pay. Then the next line, we're getting it says get the number of hours worked. So we're going to get the hours worked from the user. Down here, we're going to get the hourly pay rate from the user. Then we're going to calculate the pay, and then we're going to display the pay to the user. So now let's look specifically at where the keywords are in this program. So remember, keywords are words that have special meaning in the language. So these are for C++. And these keywords can't be used for any other purpose. So some examples of keywords in this program are the using, namespace, int, double, and return. So these are all keywords and they all have specific meanings, and we can't use those words for anything else. So we can't say declare a variable and call our variable double or call our variable return. All right, and then programmer defined identifiers. So remember variables, these are names that are made up by the programmer, and they're basically used to represent a storage space in memory. So let's draw let's pretend like this is our computer's memory. And so let's just say that this is our memory locations. So let's say that let's just say this represents 8 spots in memory. So what we want to do with this is we're going to say double, and just to tell you right now, this double is a floating point. So I think it's going to be clear pretty quickly why we spent time talking about binary and internal representation, because knowing binary and the kind of the basics of internal representation, we know how these variables are being stored in memory. And So, and we're going to get to this in a minute, but it turns out in C++, we need to tell the computer what our variable type is. So in other words, we had to tell the compiler that these are floating points. So double is a floating point. We're going to learn about that a little bit later. But anyway, so our variables are hours, rate, and pay. And one thing I want you to notice is that these variables are named things that represent what they are. So hours represents the number of hours worked, rate represents the pay rate, and pay represents the pay. So you always want to name your variables things that represent what they are. Don't name your variables like A, B, C. That's going to make your program really hard to read. It's not going to make sense. So make sure to name your variables things that names that make sense for what they are. So what we're doing with this is we're saying, okay, we want a spot in memory that we can store a floating point number. And we're going to call that spot in memory hours. So now when we store a value to hours, we're accessing that memory location in the computer and we're storing our floating point number to that location. So this just makes things easier because the other way we could do it is so these memory locations are represented with hexadecimal numbers. So this might be something that looks like this, like just a really long number with zeros and characters with digits and characters. And if we had to, like, let's say we wanted to store something in this location, if we had to refer to it with the address, that would make programming really hard. So we just want to use a symbolic name that makes sense. So then we can say hours, and when we call hours, we're going to automatically access that memory location and be able to store something there. All right, so, and I already mentioned the variable name should reflect the purpose, so that's really important. All right, so variable definitions. So just to talk a little bit more about variables, the computer can store two types of data. So two types of data. Basically numbers and characters. So the types of numbers that we can store are whole numbers. So these are numbers like 5, 7, -20, and we can store floating point numbers. So these are fractional numbers. So like pi, so 3.14, 159, 6.7. So these are floating point numbers. So this just goes back to like why we spent time talking about binary and how these numbers are represented in memory, because it helps us figure out what, like for instance, if we have a floating point number, we know how that's stored in memory. If we have a whole number, we know how that's stored in memory. So it turns, and this is important for C++ because in C++ you have to know what type of data is being stored when you create a variable. So I'm just going to say that you must know what type of data is being stored to create a variable in C++. So for instance, with the example program, we had double, rate, hours, and pay. So we declared all of these as doubles, which double is a floating point. And so we had to know ahead of time that those were doubles. We could have also declared them as basically a whole number, which would be an integer. So if we said int hours, like let's say they can only enter whole number hours, then we would declare that as an integer. And we're gonna have an entire section on, or video on, these different variable types. So right now the point is just recognize that we have two types of data, basically numbers and characters, and then we can represent our data as whole numbers or floating point numbers. And when we declare a variable, so like right here, we're declaring these variables. When we declare a variable, basically what we're doing is we're reserving a spot in memory for that variable type. All right, so just a little bit, so we talked a little bit about operators already. Let's just point out a few in this program. So this multiply right here is an operator. The hours and rate are operands. This equals is an operator. Pay is an operand. The hours times rate is an operand. And then some other operators that we're going to talk about a little bit later are these. So these are all operators, and we're going to talk more about those later. And then punctuation, so this just marks the end of a statement. So if we look at this program, notice how we have semicolons at the end of most of these lines. So these semicolons are marking the ends of these statements. So for instance, right here, so we're declaring our variables. So we say double hours rate pay, and then we have a semicolon to indicate that we're done with that particular command, or we're done with that statement. And then here, don't worry about what the cout means right now, but basically we're displaying how many hours did you work to the screen. And then we have a semicolon to indicate that we're at the end of that statement. So C++ is really picky about punctuation. You're going to need to make sure that if you don't get the punctuation correct, it's going to give you a compilation error. Some other punctuation are these. So these mark the beginning and end. So and these curly braces are also considered punctuation.